Hi, it's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to another edition of Q&A with a Coach. Today we have a question from our friend Colin. Colin says, "Hey Ramsey, maybe you can answer this question in a video." Maybe I can. Let's find out, because I believe it to be very interesting. Tony Ferguson said at his recent press conference that he has not sparred since 2016. There is footage of him grappling online, but there is no footage of sparring. How feasible is it that a high-level MMA fighter with so much experience doesn't need to spar? Okay, that is a great question, Colin. Now, there are a number of different professional fighters out there saying very similar things right now. Like Robbie Lawler a few years back in an interview said, "I haven't sparred in 10 years, something like that." And that shocked the world. Because he said that right after one of his greatest performances in the UFC, where it was this big knockout, drag-out brawl, and amazing fight. Man, I'm blanking on his opponent's name. Who was that? Anyway, one of Robbie Lawler's last fights. Anytime Robbie Lawler came into the cage, he gave these tremendous performances, and you would never think that's a guy who doesn't spar. But what Robbie Lawler meant by that was not he never puts on the gloves and moves around with people throwing punches and kicks at him. Okay? He means he didn't get into fights at the gym. And it's possible that Tony Ferguson means the same thing, but then again, Tony Ferguson may in fact be the type of guy to actually not spar, to prepare for a fight. Who knows? Who knows? But I assume what's probably going on is Tony Ferguson is saying something very similar, that he doesn't get into fights at the gym anymore. He's saving that for the octagon. And that is smart. That is what I am constantly telling my students, my fighters, and the YouTube viewers to do. To focus on light contact technical sparring. There's an issue with the word sparring. Some people hear that and they think it just means a fight at the gym. And if that's you, stop, because you are going to stunt your career. You are going to give yourself a much shorter career than you could have otherwise. 20 years ago when I started training, all people did was hard sparring, heavy sparring. It was fighting in the gym. Any sparring session was an actual fight. And we all just thought that's the way it is. We want our training to be as realistic as possible, so we are going to fight in the gym. We're going to go hard, maybe harder than we actually would in a fight. And what ended up happening, we got hurt, we got injuries, we didn't log a lot of training time, and man, it held me back in a lot of ways. It gave me post-traumatic stress disorder, man. PTSD, that's what it's going to give you. It's going to put you in a frame of mind where you cringe at the thought of sparring. And you don't want that. You want to be excited about sparring. You want to be, if you're a professional fighter, you want to be excited about going to work. I get so many questions about how do I deal with pre-fight nerves and all that. Okay, I'll give you one. Being scared and being excited are very, very similar emotions. They're close to being the same thing. So when you feel those nerves start to set in, make that choice. Am I going to be scared, or am I going to be excited? Because you can turn that into a conscious choice. Okay? But if your body associates the idea of stepping in a cage or stepping in a ring with dread, because your body remembers being abused every time you put on the gloves, your body remembers being injured every time you step in the ring, your body remembers just being thrashed and hurt. In those situations, that is what will be going through your mind. You're going to be suffering from PTSD. Don't give yourself PTSD as a fighter. So watch how Robbie Lawler spars. I know you may not be able to find footage of Tony Ferguson sparring, but watch the way Robbie Lawler spars, because you can find footage of him sparring. And it's light contact sparring. It's light contact and technical. They are not hurting each other. They're not throwing bombs. They're not trying to knock each other out. They're not trying to mark each other up. They are trying to learn and become better, more effective fighters. Robbie Lawler said, "I don't spar anymore," meaning he doesn't get into fights at the gym anymore, "because I already know how to fight," he said. I spent a whole career learning how to fight. I know what a punch feels like. I don't need to get brain damage again and again to remind myself, oh yeah, that's what brain damage feels like. Because you only have so many heavy hits you can take. You only have so many heavy hits you can take. Your brain can only take so much, man. So Tony Ferguson not sparring, if by that he means not getting into fights in the gym, that's smart. That's something you should pay attention to. Tony Ferguson, he's a smart fighter, man. He is a smart fighter. And smart fighters, what do they want to do? They want to preserve their brains. Because ultimately, man, that is the biggest tool they're going to have. That's the tool that is going to allow them to propel themselves along the journey to being the best fighter they possibly can be. Another thing you might want to take into consideration is privacy. It's entirely possible that Tony Ferguson is doing the light sparring, the technical sparring that I advocate, that so many other modern fighters are advocating right now, and he's simply choosing not to show it to you. Why? Because, well, maybe he doesn't want his rivals to do film studies on him to see, oh yeah, we can see from the sparring footage that when an opponent reacts this way, Tony has a tendency to react this other way. And so we can capitalize on that when we fight him. That's a real thing. People do film studies. And some coaches are really, really good at doing film studies and teaching their fighters to capitalize on those tendencies. If you're not familiar how to do a film study, you don't just watch a video of somebody sparring or fighting and think, oh, they made a mistake right there. No, you don't look for the mistakes. You don't look for the mistakes because you have to expect you're going to fight a perfect fighter when you get in there that makes no mistakes. Okay? Instead, you look for tendencies. You look for tendencies. You look for their strengths, actually. What does this fighter consistently do? How do they consistently move? How can we predict them? What is a martial art? Think about that for a minute. What is a martial art, an effective martial art? Not the woo-woo martial arts, but the effective ones that allow us to win fights most effectively, most efficiently, and most often. A good martial art is one that reduces the number of variables in the equation. That's it. That's why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu shocked the world so much during UFC 1, it's because it was extremely effective at reducing the number of variables in the equation. There were a lot of variables in UFC 1. There were karate guys, and there were sumos, and there were, just savate guys, and just all of these different variables out there. And anything could have happened. And then Royce Gracie, using Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, reduced those numbers of variables by taking his opponents down, clinching up with them really tightly so that they couldn't use whatever kung fu tricks they had up their sleeves, and then choking them out. Why do Jiu-Jitsu fighters bring the fight to the ground in the first place? To reduce the number of variables. That's it. To make the fight more predictable. Reducing the number of variables is much more subtle, and in many ways much more complex in striking. Look at boxing, for example. How do you reduce the number of variables? You have to introduce predictive behavior, programming an opponent. And man, that can get really complicated. Much of it comes down to footwork. For example, you move in, you attack, you move slightly out of reach, out of range. The other guy follows his instinct to move into that range so he can reach you, and then you counterstrike him. By doing that, you have reduced the variables to, if I move back here, I have given my opponent a choice. He's now going to do one of two things. He will either move toward me so that he can reach me, he can close that distance, in which case I will counterstrike, or he will pivot out and invite me to move forward instead. Okay? So any effective martial art, any of them, any effective combat sports style will reduce the number of variables. So what's Tony Ferguson doing here? by not showing you his sparring, his technical drills, whatever he's doing. Because I guarantee he is moving around in the gym in ways that are teaching him and familiarizing his body with the way he needs to move in that fight under the context of a skilled champion level mixed martial artist UFC fighter trying to knock his head off or strangle him. Okay? And that involves some level of sparring. It's probably not the type of sparring that you would associate with that word sparring, especially if you come from the camp of let's knock each other's heads off. Okay? So, gonna harp on this again. Spar smarter, not harder. Spar smarter, not harder. Tony Ferguson does a lot of crazy things in his training, out there kicking steel poles and stuff, which to the average person I would say, yeah, maybe don't do that. But as far as this sparring strategy, don't get into fights in the gym, be like Tony in that way. Don't get into fights at the gym. Thanks for watching. Now get out there and train.